Welcome to the American Citizens Abroad podcast. I'm Michelle, and today I'm chatting with Leslie of Ciao Lulu, a CNBC MakeIt contributor and a B2B marketing communications leader. Welcome, and thanks for chatting with us today.
Hey, Michelle, thanks for having me. Super happy to be here to share my experiences about living and working abroad. I am a huge fan, a big advocate of Americans looking to try or consider working and living abroad.
So let's get into it. Could you tell us a bit about your expat journey? How long have you been living abroad, and what took you overseas?
Definitely can tell you. I'll take the easy questions first. So, how long have I been here? Last January, January 5th, I celebrated my 20-year anniversary of living in Milan. 20 years, I think that's like what is it? An emerald, maybe for the gemstone. I should go out and maybe get myself something. 20 years in Milan. What took me here? Work, and I'll spend a little time on that, but I'll tell you a little bit about the motivation and my journey. Don't laugh. My journey started back in high school. During high school, I was a competitive soccer player. Prior to my junior year, I played on a select soccer team with players from around New England that traveled to the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And that's really the start of my journey. I went there obviously to play soccer, and that was the main point, but we had lots of time to sightsee and learn about the cultures of these different countries. That was my aha moment. Everything was new. Didn't understand the language. The people were different. The architecture was different. The food was different. Everything was different. And I loved that. It was just something I had not seen before. I'm from the Boston area, so it was all new. And I knew at that point that I wanted to do something later in life that would involve travel, potentially being overseas. I had no clue what it was, but that was the start of my journey. I ended up finishing high school, going to Boston College. I was a business major and studied abroad again. I went to Florence, Italy to take my arts electives. Again, great experience. I'm going to date myself here, but the year was 89 in Germany. The Berlin Wall was coming down. So being in Europe at that time was extremely interesting. Came back to Boston College, finished, got a degree in finance, worked in finance a couple of years, didn't really like it. I was bored, ended up doing some soul searching early in my career and found out I really wanted to get back into marketing was one of my favorite classes, communications. Ended up taking a job that took me to Miami where I worked for Royal Caribbean, the cruise line. I worked in corporate communications, and part of my responsibility was media relations. So, promoting new itineraries, new ships, new programs to media from all over the world. I did tons of travel. I met colleagues from every different country. And it was at that point that I said, okay, I want to work abroad. And I decided to go back for my MBA, and I went to a very specialized school where to graduate, you had to work outside, do a business school internship outside your home country. So I did some studies at Bocconi University here in Milan, and then did a business school internship with Pirelli and finished my studies, came back to the US, was working, and about a year and a half later, I get a call from the HR manager who I knew from my internship asking me if I wanted to interview for a job in a new business group that they had where they were trying to expand outside of Italy. I'd be leading marketing communications. And I said, yes, yes. Did the interview, flew to Milan in like November of 2004, got the job. And in January, I was here in Milan. So that's my long journey.
We discovered you through an article in CNBC Make It you wrote, which included the top 4 lessons you learned while living in Milan. Could you recap those for our listeners?
Sure. And I think once you hear the 4 lessons. I think they kind of apply probably across, not just specific to Italy, but could probably apply in other markets. The first lesson I learned was you got to go with the flow. When I got here, I was a little bit of an A type and sweated like the little things that you have no control over. And for me, coming to Italy, there's a lot of bureaucracy. This is one of the downsides of living in Italy, the bureaucracy. And in the beginning, whether it was getting an ID card or getting my health card or whatever I had to do down at the comune, which is the town hall where you had to go to get your essential documents, it would be often that you go, long waits, you get to the counter, and maybe the person's not nice, and they tell you, hey, you needed 5 copies and you only brought 2, and they send you away, and you blow up and you get all mad. You have to learn to go with the flow, come back the next day. That's just how it is. In Italy, we have a lot of transportation strikes. So the first one, I mean, I was so stressed out. I'm like, what about work? And the way these things work is that the transportation works like your bus or metro or train. They'll work for a certain period, then they stop, and then they work for a window in the afternoon, and you have to adjust your schedule. And I was so freaked out, like, oh, I'm going to have to leave work early. But then you think everybody who doesn't have a car has to leave work early. So you just learn to adjust. And these are things that they announce. So be prepared, but you got to leave work early. You got to leave work early. After the pandemic, of course, with remote working, hybrid working, it's a little bit easier. So if you know there's a strike, you can just say, look, I'm going to work from home. But up until there was the pandemic, it was like people, I was just so stressed. And then I finally said, okay, this is just how it is. You got to go with the flow. The next lesson I would say for me was learning to be determined. 5 years into my expat experience, my company, Pirelli, sold our division. So now I'm out of work, right? And I have a year left on my work permit, permesso di soggiorno. And of course, I'm freaking out. We're at the end of the remnants of the global financial crisis. So I have interviews set up and then people calling me, HR managers, sorry, but we're having a hiring freeze. And so I'm getting stressed. I'm like, am I going to have to go home? I got a job in another country, but then I would lose my work permit here. So to get through all that, I was just really determined to get not just any job, but a good job here in Italy. I really exercised my network back home. I had to put myself out there. You have to definitely step outside your comfort zone because this is a kind of who you know culture. So I had to meet people and had to get out in front of people and had to do this within a year. I ended up getting a great job with an American multinational 2 months before the expiration of my work permit. So I learned to, when I wanted something, to be determined. Third lesson, when you're working outside your home country, is all about working differently, right? Now it's easy to say the words, this is how we do it. And when you hear that, you got to stop yourself because if you do that a lot, you just turn off people. You're in a new location and what's going to come right back at you? Well, that's not how we do it here. So you have to be flexible. You have to pick up on the signs from those around you. You have to have a little bit of humility and vulnerability, especially if you're working in a country where you have to learn a foreign language. You're going to mess up. You're going to say stupid things, okay? And you have to be able to laugh at yourself. This is where you got to leave perfectionism behind. Because if you have that kind of mentality, you're not going to learn the language. You're not going to integrate, and the experience is going to be very different. The other thing, for example, in Italy, and I find this in many European countries, is I got here, it's lunchtime, and I'm sitting at my desk, not eating. Everybody's looking at me like, are you sick? Why don't you come to lunch? I'm like, no, I'll just stay here and work. And I learned later that, like, okay, you can't do that. Healthier, go get up, walk to the cafeteria, have lunch, but it also helps you integrate better. Also, sometimes important business things are happening in kind of more social parts of the day, whether it be lunch. a coffee break or a business dinner. I had to learn to stop that lunch at the desk thing and do what everyone else was doing. And then the fourth point is around budgeting and planning for the life I wanted. Look, I've been here 20 years. There's few things that surprise me now, but aside from things like understanding the cost of living or getting an apartment and understanding what utilities cost and your transportation costs, you have to think about other things like as an American, and I know this group talks a lot about it, taxes. After my first year working for an Italian company, I'm on a work permit. I'm an American citizen. I remember having this conversation with my dad. He was, what about your American taxes? What about them? My Italian company doesn't know, like they're not experts in that. And I had met some other newbie type Americans at the consulate in Milan. And I'm asking people, and everybody's kind of like, hey, I don't know. No, you don't. And so that's where it was great to know the American community, know people that had been there for some time and like saying, look, Americans, we're taxed based on citizenship. So, yes, if you want to keep your citizenship in the US, you better file your taxes. So, knowing these things, what you have to plan for. So, for 20 years, I've been filing taxes, 2 countries. I have 2 different accountants. You need to factor that in. And I think the longer you stay in a place, you got to think about things like Social Security. And in Italy, there's the equivalent. And knowing the different agreements between countries. So Italy and America, we have great relations, and there's a lot of these cross-country treaties to help balance out workers like myself who have put in the time in the US, put in the time in another country. Which benefits do you get? So these are some of the things you need to think about. And then there's some of those like surprise moments. Like I wanted to get my license, my driver's license. And here you can get your driver's license at 18. So meanwhile, I'm an adult sitting in a class with 18-year-olds because you have to take the test again. They won't convert your American license. There's a couple nuances in the rules. But it cost me 700 euros to get my license. And I was like, you're kidding me. I guess when I was in high school, these things, I mean, maybe my parents paid, but I can't imagine that the fee to get a license costs that much. I learned about budgeting, planning. Some things are going to pop up. Some taxes that you can't even imagine that exist are going to pop up. So those are the 4 areas. One plus, though, that I forgot to mention that balances out some of that budgeting and expenses is healthcare. In a lot of European countries, definitely Italy, we have a public health care system. Everybody's covered. And even if you have a work permit because you are on a local contract, you're paying local taxes, you get access to public health care. And when you work in a company of a certain size, so I think like medium to large, and I've always been in probably companies on the large size, you get private insurance too, and you can use these interchangeably. And it's amazing, honestly. And even with private health coverage, the expenses are nowhere near what I remember from paying in the US and what I hear when I talk to friends and family about what they pay. So that is a huge bonus and just a kind of it is a funny story now. When I was between my first and second job, I still had my work permit, still had public health care. I was going into the hospital, just a very routine procedure. Prior to this procedure, the technician discovered that I had a cyst in my spleen. And that stopped everything. I had to do testing. I was freaked out, but luckily nothing dangerous. But this cyst was the size of a golf ball. And I needed to get my spleen removed. And I'm like, okay, hold on. I'm in a foreign country. The medical system is great. Got another opinion. And they're like, yes, you should get your spleen because if your spleen ruptures, that can be life-threatening. Went into the hospital, stayed there a week. Different concept than in the US where you have some sort of operation and you got to leave the next night or something or that evening. Here it was like I was there a week and I'm like, get me out of here because I want to monitor you, make sure everything's okay. And I was leaving the hospital. I was with my companion and wait a minute, don't I have to pay a bill or something? And because the surgery was necessary, meaning deemed necessary because it could become life-threatening, There was no bill. And I remember sitting there like, okay, no, this can't be. Are you sure? To go to a hospital, have that kind of service. I had the best surgeon doing my surgery, and then there's no fee for that. Just makes you think.
There's a fantasy some Americans have of living abroad, which is far from reality. What challenges have you faced as an American in Milan?
I think, and this can apply with living at home, living abroad, anything in life that you want or that's good, you really have to work at it. I love all these expat shows, and I love Emily in Paris. I do. Well done. I like the actors. I'm always waiting for the next season to come out. I like how they make fun. The generalizations, they're true. The American that is in Europe and how the French behave. I mean, it's just a really fun series. There's another part of that, and I guess it would be a documentary if you went through the things that you have to go through. So the legal right to be here as Americans, you don't think about that. It is really difficult to live and work in Europe. I think it's become a little bit easier since I came 20 years ago. I will tell you that I came in January. I worked as a consultant because I didn't have the legal right to be here. I mean, to work as a person employed in Italy. 3 months later, so you have 90 days, I had to go home and wait to find out if I was admitted into the quota. There was a quota system for these different skilled workers, different types of workers. Found out I was in, got the paperwork, and honestly, I was really lucky because my company sponsored me. I had a mobility manager helping me doing all the heavy lifting. But still, it was stressful. So find out I'm in the quota. Luckily in Boston, there's a consulate. There's an Italian consulate. So didn't have to travel to another state, but you have to go to the consulate and do some paperwork there. And it's not like a day thing. You go there, make an appointment. I ended up 3 weeks doing this stuff with the consulate, the Italian consulate in Boston, because you need to get the visa stamped in your passport to come back to Italy. And so I think from January until July, that's how much time it took to get this work permit. Then you have to set up a bank account. The company put me up, paid for my living, but you have to get a bank account. You have to find a place to live. That was like 7 months. That's a pain. And I don't know anybody who liked that process. So that's not something that comes out in the show. You know what I mean? You have to really take calculated risks. You have to put yourself out there. You have to get outside your comfort zone. And it's not easy. It's not easy for me. I don't know that, maybe there are some people that's just like, they don't care. It's a challenge when you think you have to do things that you're embarrassed or afraid to mess up. So these are the things that I think we overlook. The other thing, you're going to have moments of loneliness. I love Thanksgiving. I love 4th of July. And I think in the 20 years, I probably went home for one 4th of July and maybe one or two Thanksgivings. And the Thanksgiving was probably because I was on a work trip and was able to stop home because I normally come home for a chunk of my vacation at Christmas. The two holidays are pretty close and you're trying out the year. So you're going to have moments of loneliness. You're going to miss holidays. You're going to miss family members. And I don't care how many friends you have, how integrated you are. I think these are normal feelings to go through. Now, Thanksgiving, a lot of Americans will get together maybe on a weekend because it's not a holiday here. I see more and more restaurants trying to do the Thanksgiving meal. And it's funny to go to those sometimes because there's lots of Italians. They want to understand what Thanksgiving is all about. There's these, not the real thing, but temporary fixes. Those are some of the things that you have to contend with. You're by yourself. You've uprooted your life and you're somewhere new. There's going to be those challenges of creating that life for yourself. The other thing I would say, you're going to encounter people you want to stay away from. What I mean by that is, generally speaking, Americans are loved, I would say. People are fascinated by the newness of America, how big America is, all the innovation, the opportunity. Both sides of my family, my mother's family's Greek, my father's family's Italian. My grandparents immigrated to the US for better life. People love America. Now, that love for America goes up and down, depending what's going on in America. But generally speaking, America, oh, it's cool. But you're going to meet simple minded people who are going to trash America. They're going to look at you weird and say, why would you leave home? Why would you come here? And you're going to meet these people. And so you just got to learn to like, yeah, I get it, in one ear, out the other. So I think those are some of the things you got to contend with. And it's not all la dolce vita. Again, you have to work at creating a life that you want when you're abroad.
While on your expat journey, what has surprised you the most?
Well, one thing, Michelle, that's really surprised me that I think it'd be great for everybody to go through being a foreigner, being an immigrant. When I got here, your work permit, your ID card, your health card, everything stamped with non-EU citizen, or in Italian, you're extracomunitario, you're outside the union. And think about that. At home, we never think, immigrant, foreigner. It puts things in perspective for what some other people are going through. I think it makes you more tolerant, more open minded to being labeled what we see other people being labeled in the press and the negativeness around people who come from other countries. When you go to get your work permit, the first couple of work permits, I had to go to the big, it's called Questura di Milano, and it's like a police station with an immigration center. You see everything there, okay? There are people seeking asylum. There are people who are refugees. There are young teens without their parents that got to Italy. I mean, you see everything. And I think that experience puts things in perspective. I'm not a refugee. I'm not seeking asylum, but seeing other people, seeing what they're going through, and just that little bit of having those labels of being outside the union gives you some perspective and tolerance. The other thing that surprised me, the people I meet, whether it's through work or in my personal circles, I have met people, not just Italians or other Americans or Europeans. I have met people from everywhere. And I think that is one of the huge pluses of this experience. And then from a work perspective, I've been presented with opportunities. I've interviewed and been recruited by companies across EMEA. So not only Europe, Middle East, Africa, and I would probably never have had these opportunities if I had stayed back in the US. I was able to establish myself here as an international marketing professional, and that just opened so many doors that you can't imagine. And I think the last thing I would say is work-life balance. I think Americans need some work there. The not taking lunch, not taking vacation. I don't know what you're waiting for. You can still be productive and have a good lunch and take vacation. So those would be the things that really surprised me the most.
How has living abroad changed you?
Just looking back on some of our earlier discussion, not sweating the small things. I've been able to go with the flow, deal with things as they happen. I think that's how this experience has changed me. I'm better able to manage change or uncertain circumstances. I think even before COVID and the pandemic arrived, okay, that was a massive change. I felt that, okay, you're stuck in your house, nobody knows what's happening. I kind of was able to deal with it. I had friends that really freaked out about being at home, not being able to leave. We had to have little certificates if we were going somewhere to say why we were going somewhere because of how difficult COVID was. But I think my earlier experience just helped me to take a day at a time, deal with things as they come. I feel like I'm more resourceful. when you go abroad and if you go by yourself, you're thrown into the deep end a lot of times with any kind of problem, and you have to find a solution because there's nobody else who's going to find it for you. So, resourcefulness, and again, just being tolerant, resilient, and just open minded, hearing other people's perspectives, new ways to approach problems, understanding why somebody thinks differently or why they do something in a different way. I think this experience might even at the beginning force you to see how people approach problems and why they think the way they think. So that's how this experience has changed me.
And what tips can you give to someone who's considering taking a job assignment that will relocate them overseas?
Research is critical outside of what you get from your employer. Do your due diligence. I would approach it in a couple different ways. What's the time frame? If you're going for a very short period of time, is it less than a year? Is it multiple years? I think that might impact your decision. It might impact a decision about, does this make sense for me? Does this make sense for my career? Does it make sense? What if I'm coming over with a partner, a spouse, children? How does this move impact not only me, but my family? You have to look at that. You have to really understand the offer. So, what is the company offering you? They're uprooting you. Is there an increase in salary? I really think there should be some in most cases. Maybe there's an opportunity for you to negotiate up. Are you getting more responsibility, a promotion, a new title? So, just understanding what's entailed. Part of that offer discussion, relocation. The company should pay. Do they pay all of it? Do they pay a portion of it? How am I going to find a place to live? Will you have a mobility manager to help you integrate quickly so you can go to work? What's the transportation like? Where is the office? Sometimes I worked at a place that was kind of out in the middle of nowhere once, and getting there was a pain. I didn't have a car. Understanding where the place is. Do I need to get my license right away? How does the public transportation work? What about the legal aspect? Again, the bureaucracy. You probably need a tax ID number. You need an identification card. You need some sort of work permit. You're going to need a health card depending on where you go. Is it just private insurance or do they have a public health care system? Taxes. Again, the whole tax, as Americans, we have to file because we are taxed based on citizenship and not based on residency. What about the local taxes? Is there an agreement between the US and where I'm going? Language. Do they speak English there? Will the work be in English? If not, are you going to support me to get some intensive language training so that I can do my job? What about the retirement system? If I'm getting paid in the local currency, am I contributing to a local social security or a pension fund? What happens when I leave? Do I get that back or do I get the credit through the US system? The whole cost of living, getting set up in an apartment. And there I would say, like from a living perspective, I mentioned that I had a mobility manager when I first moved here, and they kept looking for apartments in a certain radius of the office. And I said, okay, I knew how to get to the office, but I knew where I wanted to live. I did my own research. As a female coming by myself, safety was important. Not that they were proposing unsafe places, but I wanted a place that I could easily walk to the center of Milan. I like to run. Where can I live where I have the ability to go run? I wanted a place where the supermarket was close and entertainment and restaurants. And like I said, a quick walk to the center. And I wanted to be comfortable in my surroundings. So even when you do get support, you have to really be proactive because there's nothing worse than living somewhere and you don't want to be hindered or afraid to walk out the door. And then I would say, I know there are multiple camps. I don't want to meet other Americans because then I won't meet locals. But I think it's important to have an American network when you're abroad. Things like I said about the taxes and other things that your Italian network won't know because they don't think about those things. Social Security, pension, retirement. The other Americans are going to have those same concerns. So find the Americans in that place. And again, it depends. Like if you're going for a very short period of time, still good to know how this impacts your contribution to Social Security or your pension fund or whatever. But the longer you stay and the more moves you make, the more complex your life becomes. The US government has the Smart Traveler program. Definitely that's a good program to enroll in. Stay in touch, obviously, with family back home, and then be sure to ask the question, what happens? What happens when this is done? I went and worked in an Italian company, so there wasn't like what happens next. But if you're being sent over from your employer in the US, do I have a job when I come back? It's good to understand that. And as an American, and if you're going to go back, you need to keep in touch with your colleagues in the US because sometimes out of sight, out of mind. Those would be some considerations I would for Americans evaluating overseas work.
And do you have any advice specifically for women on how to get an expat job assignment?
For women now, more than ever before, we have more opportunities to work abroad. And I think things like outside of the company, things like digital nomad visas, I think these are a great opportunity, especially if you're a woman and you have a plan and you want to have a family at a certain time and you want to do things at a certain time in your life. I think this opens the door to go live in another country. You're not necessarily working for a company in that country, but you're doing everything else. You're living there. You have the right to be there with that visa, and you can still get that experience of living abroad. Alternatively, if you work in a company that has an international footprint, I would say, okay, look, these would be things also probably for a male candidate as well, but be assertive, speak up. Any major company now has an intranet with a career portal. Fill out your career profile. A lot of times, your company, I can't tell you how many times I was asked, will you relocate? Make sure you check that box that you're willing to relocate. But what I think women need to do, and they don't do enough of, is any good manager needs to look after their team's training and development and career progression. So as a female, have that discussion with your manager. Look, I'd love to have an opportunity where I can work overseas. Tell HR, circulate this with your internal network in the company. And if you have a mentor, talk to your mentor. A lot of big companies have mentoring programs. How can you go abroad? Sometimes transfers in the sense that I've seen in my own experience, I saw colleagues, female colleagues from the US, take up jobs that we couldn't get filled in whatever market it was and volunteered and got the job. Acquisitions. I was on one of my companies, acquired another company. I was on the integration team. I was already in Europe. The acquisition was in Europe. So doing a lot of flying back and forth to Italy. But my colleagues from the US were coming over and had the opportunity to be in country because that wasn't as convenient going back and forth. Product launches, sometimes whatever business you're in, you're introducing a new product and you're rolling it out across a new geography. A lot of times you need to be in market to help with the education, the training your sales team, your customer service team. So that's an opportunity. If you're in like an enterprise IT area and the company itself is rolling out new technology or new software upgrades, sometimes that's an opportunity to travel with a new enterprise-wide solution, new offices, rotational programs. There are still companies that have rotational programs. One of the companies I worked in had a functional rotational program where people moved around. They stayed in an office or in a business for so many months and kept moving around. Rotational programs for new talent. If you're labeled or deemed a high achiever, they have these rotational programs that where you do cross border. So explore these things. I think you have to really be proactive, and I think women need to be proactive in this area as well. And then outside of your company, I met women who are teaching is still a big thing, especially teaching English. volunteering. And of course, I'm also an advocate for studying abroad. I studied abroad, getting my undergraduate degree, and I studied abroad in business school. I think that might not be the end game, but that certainly it opened a door for me.
And pivoting, what is the expat community like in Milan? Who is it composed of?
Milan's kind of a special place. People just used to overlook Milan. I think of like when the tour groups come through, they do the drive by in Milan, they spend a day, don't really get to know the city, and then they zoom on to some other, it could be Como Lake, go down to Rome, the kind of known travel destinations. Milan is not only an industrial or working city, it's got everything. We have the arts. So you got La Scala here. We're the fashion capital of the world, and we're a global hub for innovation, design, and architecture. There's just so much going on here, and people just don't recognize that. It's got a lot of beauty. You don't recognize that if you come here for a day and zip through. So, expat community, something that's, I think, new is we got a huge community of students. So, at the university and graduate level, there are schools in many schools in Milan, but there are several schools here that are internationally recognized. So you got Bocconi for economics and finance. You have Cattolica, which is, I think, more of a general education. There's Polytechnical, where you go for engineering, architecture. And these are schools that have multiple different types of degrees, especially when you talk about graduate, and they're all recognized globally for the quality of the education and the diversity of the students. So, students, we got people in fashion. There's a consulate here, not a huge community, but there are some people associated with the consulate. But most of the people I would say here have come here for work, are still here for work, probably formed a family and have kids. And so that, to me, that's the main group. This isn't the countryside of Tuscany. You're not going to get people retiring to Milan. They're going to go to another part of Italy.
If you could give your younger self advice before relocating to Italy, what would it be?
That's a tough one. Okay, so the advice I would give myself, don't hold back. You really got to take advantage of every opportunity, getting outside that comfort zone. Sometimes you get invitations to do things, and "Oh, I don't feel like doing that." And every time I said, okay, I'll go, it's been something phenomenal. So, really taking advantage of every opportunity. I think I've had some misses there. I wish I started my dual citizenship process earlier. That seemed to have taken forever. So I was constantly, every 2 years, you're renewing the work permit. And with the renewal of that, I had to renew the health card. It just became just a lot of nonsense work. And then I would say you really should have an exit strategy. And whatever that strategy is, and of course, you can change the strategy, you can update that strategy. What is the point where maybe it's time to go? And that is something that every person needs to think of. Maybe it's not so drastic. Maybe it's get out of the city or go to the countryside, or it could be go back home. But everybody needs to think about when is it time. It may be that it's never, but having an idea of a plan when you need to evaluate your next move.
And do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Being abroad just really is such an enriching experience. I really wish that more and more people, I know that it can be prohibitive, there's costs associated, but having an experience to work outside of your home country is just so invaluable. I think in general, across the globe, if more and more people had these experiences, I think being more tolerant, being more open minded, aside from learning a new culture, learning a new language, enhancing or bettering your career, because the opportunities when you do have this experience can propel you and move you up that career ladder. It can be scary, and I was scared at first and thought, what am I doing? Is this a mistake? But honestly, having an opportunity to work outside your home is really invaluable. And the last thing that I want to add is you also appreciate home too. The things that were easier to do at the US, I appreciate that. The bureaucracy, like I said, in older countries, especially like in Italy, sometimes that drives you nuts. I appreciate the way things work at home. I appreciate the education I got at home. I appreciate the values that we have in the US. I think these experiences, the only way to do that is when you leave, right? How can you appreciate something if you're always there? If you have the opportunity, even for a short period of time, if it works with what's going on in your life, do it. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
Thank you, Michelle, for having me.
The American Citizens Abroad podcast is a monthly podcast that is published the second Tuesday of each month. It is edited and produced by me, Michelle, and is a product of American Citizens Abroad. You can email us at podcast@americansabroad.org. Remember, give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts so other Americans living abroad can find us. The content of ACA podcasts, including documents and presentations, is made available solely for general information purposes. It is not intended and should not be treated as legal, financial, or tax advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views of American Citizens Abroad, Inc., or any affiliated organization. ACA does not warrant the accuracy, completeness, or usefulness of any content or other information. ACA disclaims all liability and responsibility arising from any reliance placed on any content or information by you or any other person. ACA is nonpartisan and does not support any political party or candidate.